Batter up! Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Monday Movies podcast show. Call it what you like. I'm Tom Gibbs of TGMA Productions, and I'm joined here once again by the man with a plan, Stand Wilks.
A plan? That is very generous. No, I'm Stan. Great to be here. We're talking about Back to the Future 2, a film that is surprisingly divisive and kind of underrated. Gibbsy, Back to the Future 2, where do you stand on it?
I'm going to have to agree with you there, here, Stan. Back to the Future 2, having watched both of them recently for Monday Movies, of course. Back to the Future 2, it's a sequel that kind of delivers off of the some of the points from the first film, but it doesn't differentiate it too much, and it still makes it feel like a Back to the Future film. And for me, it retains a lot of the charm that was had in the original.
I would agree with you. That's a really good point on the whole concept of going to what we have previously established, because it does tread familiar ground in that it goes back to very similar plot points from the first film, but it has a very fun time travel non-linear twist to it, where obviously the future of the world is at stake. The potential of the world to be different has obviously come true, basically because of a sports almanac. It's the butterfly effect exaggerated, isn't it?
It is. How on my first watch through a couple of years ago, I sort of I knew that Marty's going to go save his kids, but then the runtime was about an hour and 40 minutes. So when the job was done, and when Griff was arrested for smashing into the courthouse building,
I was framed.
About 30 minutes into the film, you think, surely that can't be it. But then you get a slight, just the sports almanac that you mentioned briefly, that Marty had bought and that Doc had quote unquote disposed of. It comes back to haunt them eventually, and I really like how just that. I mentioned briefly in Back to the Future, the previous episode of Monday Movies, how Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale always leave these little details in that eventually expand to what was much bigger than what they may have originally intended.
It is. It's a really good example. And you mentioned the first 30 minutes, and obviously maybe one of the most entertaining segments of the film is obviously when they go to 2015 and Marty has to prevent his future son from doing a terrible crime. And it's a lovely little setup. And ultimately, it's not necessarily filler, but it's really there to establish the characters again, establish the new setting, because 2015 obviously comes and plays a big part later on. But I was just thinking of it earlier, I really love that Back to the Future 2 is exploring greed, because it's a very simple act of buying a sports almanac, and unfortunately greed gets to you, and he realizes that power, he could do so much with it, but it's like Spider-Man, isn't it? Great power, great responsibility. If it goes in the wrong hands, you're screwed. And as we find out, an alternate 1985 timeline leads to Biff Tannen becoming a Trump-like businessman who has got a lot of money, a lot of casinos, and is doing very well. But it's actually a surprisingly dark film, isn't it?
It's very interesting, I think, that you brought up the comparison to Trump there, because that's one thing I had written down as a small thing that I've noticed, is that there are similarities in that scene where you're introduced to Biff Tannen's new casino in that alternate 1985 timeline, and there are some similarities in there, some very much even in physical appearance at the time
100%.
to Donald Trump. This very rich man that doesn't seem to care for very much else apart from his own wealth.
Yes, exactly. It's actually another great performance by Thomas F. Wilson. Everyone across the board throughout this whole trilogy is just brilliant. And I love that even, in Back to the Future 2 especially, everyone's is able to play a different version of themselves, really. Michael J. Fox is playing about 3 or 4 different versions of himself. He's playing his normal Marty McFly, his younger son, Marty McFly Jr., I think it is, right? And an older version of Marty McFly in 2015, where he gets a fax machine, because apparently fax machines still exist in 2015 and is told that he's fired.
Indeed.
Hey, needles.
Hey, needles. Marty also plays his daughter, which I didn't realise until the second watch through. I was like, wait a minute, that's Marty McFly in drag.
Really?
He plays Marlene McFly.
No, I've seen this film so many times and I never knew that.
Thing is, though, once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's one thing I've
Oh,
found.
no.
And so it was only on a very recent watch through that I picked up on that detail. But you mentioned how each of the actors do fantastic performances throughout even the trilogy. But it's especially picked up on with Back to the Future 2, I feel, because you've got so many different timelines with so many different iterations of the same character. And it's really interesting to see how they come together in their own unique timeline.
Yes, because we mentioned on the previous episode that time travel in itself is a silly concept and it is hard to do right. And I would maybe argue that Back to the Future 2 starts to dabble in maybe the slightly convoluted side of non-linear time travel screenwriting, but it does it in a way that is actually really engaging and really interesting, because I like that Back to the Future 2, as we said, it does tread familiar ground, but it does it in a way where it reinvents it, doesn't it, and makes it new and fresh. And the whole idea of observing yourself and observing other people who you've already met in just from a different time period and knowing you can't interact because of paradox and butterfly effect, and it leads to some of the most convincing visual effects you'll ever see of actors playing multiple roles in the same frame.
Yeah, the technology they used at the time, I think there's some kind of special camera they used, but it's incredible how you've got, as you mentioned, 3 different characters in one point played by the same person.
It's incredible.
It's fantastic. I love that they were able to get that so well orchestrated. One thing I picked up on with Back to the Future 2 is that if you're not familiar with timelines and the sort of space-time continuum, then Doc Brown is gradually sort of explaining it to the audience throughout the film. So when an example I'm going to use is when Marty and Doc are in Doc's garage in the alternate 1985, and they're trying to work out what they need to do.
Yes,
or at least Marty is. Of course, Doc's always the man with the plan, because he's Doc Brown after all. I was going to say he gets up the whiteboard and starts drawing. You know how you've got the future, you've got the past, where you are currently, where they had been set up for the alternate 1985, and where they need to go back to in order to retrace the steps and prevent the future events from ever even happening.
Yeah, it's what David Tennant says in his Doc 2 episode of Blink, isn't it? You know, time is not necessarily a strict progression of cause to effect. It's more of a big ball of wibbly wobbly timey wimey stuff, and that's so true. Time is non-linear. It's not so easy to understand, is it? And that's a really simple and a really elegant way of explaining time travel, isn't it? And it kind of sums up the script of Back to the Future 2 in a nutshell. It's clever and surprisingly, dark and unnerving, and the idea of going back to the present you think is normal and discovering that this house is no longer yours, your mum has unfortunately married the person she never liked. It's got a real sense of doom and gloom to it, and I really feel for Marty in this film.
There's one thing I'll briefly mention about music while we're at this scene of Alternative of 1985.
Is it the rock music?
I was going to say it's the new compositions that were included from Alan Silvestri, because there are new motifs that are introduced alongside ones that used in the previous film to outline the mood of this current 1985, the alternative one, and the doom and gloom, the dread that followed up with it eventually.
Yes, the certain motifs and cues are coming back to me now, because it's a really intricate score. Once again, Alan Silvestri, brilliant composer, always finds a way to make the score memorable, doesn't he? And it just perfectly sets up, there's a real kind of gothic nature to it as well, especially when Marty goes to visit his own father's grave. Where's George? Where's George McFly? Marty, your father died 10 years ago and in the cemetery. And that's my horrible Leah Thompson impression. Leah Thompson, if you are watching this, I'm sorry. You are a brilliant actress and I apologise. But that scene's fantastic. It's got a real kind of, oh no, what the fuck has happened here?
Yeah, you see Marty's reaction to his own dad being killed 10 years prior at the time, but of course he had no clue because he'd only just returned to that time period. And it's probably the saddest moment I found in the film.
And I love as well that Back to the Future 2 is the unconventional sequel in that it once again, it starts to feel slightly familiar, and rightly so, because it's going back to the same things we've seen before. But it starts off quite hopeful. Everything's fine-ish. You know, obviously they've got something to do in helping Marty's children, and then the plot starts to kick in, and it's very grim, it's very dark, and by the end of it, you don't get the full resolution you'd think you'd get, because poor Doc Brown, the DeLorean gets electrocuted, and he is sent back to 1885. And once again, the whole non-linear structure of Back to the Future 2 comes into play even more, and you just think, oh man, did they ever catch a break?
Yeah, and it sort of gradually sets you up then for Back to the Future 3. Within Back to the Future 2, there were a lot of familiar scenes that were shot.
Recreated.
Yeah, recreated even. So you've got like the hoverboard chase, which is similar to the skateboard chase in the first film. You've got similar dialogue being used, but I really like that because it shows that I suppose it's more a case of identifying each character to what their personality is like and how they interact. It just shows that even in 2015, even far into the future, that it's still there, and you can still determine, that's Biff from 1985 or whenever.
And it's where the plot inconsistencies start to arise a little bit, in that Marty McFly dons a very unconvincing, secretive attire, you might say, and decides to wait in Biff's car and somehow isn't spotted. And it obviously, conveniences arise in every story that you see. That's where the film slightly falters for me, in that there are a lot of conveniences to it, and maybe you could argue plot holes, but I wouldn't necessarily it hurts the film too much, because it manages, like the original, to just hold on to that kernel of stupidity in a good way.
Yeah, that is true. There are a couple of little niggles I have with the film. The first thing I thought of when Marty donned that little that disguise outfit, I suppose, the first thing I thought was, Blues Brothers, which
yes,
was
exactly.
quite strange. Yeah, had that the pork pie hat, the sunglasses, the dark jacket. I was like, okay, is he posing as some kind of member of the Blues Brothers at that point?
It's John Belushi.
It's actually, it's John Belushi. A couple of things. I'm just looking at what I've written down. There are a couple of things, as a few people know, Back to the Future 2 and 3 were shot back to back. We'll be discussing Back to the Future 3 next episode. But I found a couple of nice little foreshadows as to Back to the Future 3 and its occurrence and its happening. And I think a few of those were when Biff Tanner is in his jacuzzi, he's watching a Western film, the shootout,
with
things
the
like that.
Clint Eastwood scene as well.
With the Clint Eastwood scene, which plays a bigger role in the next film.
And sorry to interrupt you, Gibbsy, I've got to say quickly, and the reason why that works for me as well is it doesn't feel like setup, does it? It just feels like, it's just a show he's watching, and you think, that's not going to come back at all. So it works as a funny moment, but it gets payoff in Back to the Future 3. But yeah, sorry, what are you saying?
It does. I was also going to mention about how when Doc and Marty are going to retrieve Jennifer from their future family home, and where Doc sort of mentions how they need to destroy the time machine, and he never got to visit his favourite era, which was the Old West.
Yes, that's right. They do manage to set things up without it feeling like the film is missing something because of it. It's very well done.
Yeah, and it sets you up for the third film. At the end of the second film, they do play a small mini trailer for it, but throughout the period of the second film, it's such a nice reminder as to, there's another one coming. They're going to finish the story, but throughout Back to the Future 2, they've set it up in. There's never any point where I felt, okay, this has been thrown in my face a little bit, that there is a third movie coming and that will be the setting. Just there are a couple of reminders, about the Old West, things like that, and it was quite nice for it to all wrap up at the end.
The fact that they film parts 2 and 3 back to back is so clever, because it means all three of them have such a strong continuity, and it never feels rushed, it never feels forced, it just flows so nicely.
It is. It's amazing how that's all woven together. I think it's really important for the things like this, the screenplay writers and the directors, to continuously return, because they have a similar mindset to the previous films about how they want this film to look and be presented.
So how would you surmise your thoughts? Because for me, Back to the Future 2 is not only an underrated sequel, but it's a brilliantly written sequel, and I think it actually does something interesting with the original as well. Without tarnishing it, it just manages to take that original structure and give you a different view of it from an outsider's perspective, incorporating that timeline structure. So where do you stand on it?
Out of the three films, I think Back to the Future 2 is the weakest of the three. But
Really?
I think it's the weakest of the three, but not by very much at all. I think that the three of them are still excellent films. But I think the thing that does it for me is that the Back to the Future 2 has quite a bit of time jumping. And so if you're struggling with, if you as an audience member are struggling to sort of comprehend a time era, then that would probably be one of the reasons why you may not like 2 as much as 1 and 3. But an amazing film nonetheless, and as you said, an extremely underrated sequel.
But yeah, guys, let us know what you think of Back to the Future 2, because it is actually quite a divisive film. So let us know in the comment section below what you think of it. Guys, you can find me at Stand Wilks 10 on Twitter. I've got my short films on here, as well as the previous episodes of Monday Movies and my own music. Gibbsy, where can we find you?
So I also have my own YouTube channel. I run TGMA Productions, where I upload music and audio related stuff, whether it's my own content or whether it's just music that has been uploaded for the sake of viewing. That's where you can find me. I also have a Twitter handle that I will link in the description. I will also link Stan's YouTube and Twitter down below, where you can also find his episodes of Monday Movies. I'll be uploading them to my channel too.
Excellent. Make sure you check those out, guys. Thank you very much for your time, and we shall see you in the next episode. Peace out, guys.
Indeed. See you next week, everybody.